My name is Era, and I'm the host of the Tamil Creator Podcast. I chat with creators from all over the world to share their stories and discuss hot topics in a way that I hope inspires, educates, and entertains you. Hi everyone, this is Era from the Tamil Creator. I have a very musically gifted guest today. His name is Sundar Viswanathan, and he is a Canadian musician. He's been in the game for almost 30 years. He grew up in Sudbury, and now he travels the world performing. He is a jazz world woodwind player, composer, vocalist, and international touring artist with extensive performance and teaching experience in the US and Canada. And more recently, his world jazz group Avatar took home the 2022 JUNO for Jazz Album of the Year for group, and with their album Worldview. So welcome to the show, Sundar. Thank you for making time, considering you are just getting over getting sick.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start at the beginning. I mean, I'm always fascinated by people in the Tamil community that have somehow been able to convince their parents to do something other than the traditional career paths. How did you manage to convince your parents that pursuing music professionally was viable in their eyes?
Well, the convincing happened when I showed them that I could do it. Up till that point, it was all they were skeptical. I mean, my mom's side of the family is very musical, so they understood that someone can have passion about the arts and about music specifically, and that how important it can be in someone's life. But at the same time, both my dad and my mom, like you say, they were by no means were they traditional Indian parents, though. They were very open-minded Indians, especially for the day when I was growing up. So they were open to give me an option to they would say, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And the only reason my dad really allowed me, like quote unquote, allowed me to go and continue music as a career was because I promised him that I would get my doctorate. and he was a professor, so that made sense to him. So he for him was, if you got your doctorate, you have a job. That was his thinking in those days. So along the way, I mean, an interesting point is that my mom, mind you, I left home when I was 17, went to university, and I was away. Since then, I'd been away from home. So she had only heard me actually play my own music the past couple of years. Is the first time she actually heard me play my own music. Believe me, it's crazy. It seems crazy because it was a long time that I've been doing it, but she has not actually heard me play live my own music until recently.
You grew up in Sudbury, so are your parents still living there?
Yeah, my dad passed in 2005. My mom is now in Mississauga. So we left Sudbury when he passed, and then she moved into Caledon first. It was like she has a condo up there in a community, and then now she's in Mississauga. So we have a lot of family. So I still consider Sudbury a kind of a home base. But in the olden days, it was tough to make them happy with regard to what I was doing. And the only way that really, I'll be too honest, that the only time that I knew that my dad was happy with my career choice was when twice maybe, when I got I didn't have my doctorate before he passed away, now that I think about it. No, I got my job before he passed away. I could tell he was happy because I was the only second time in my life I saw him cry. when I got a job, he knew I was okay. So they were very they understood that I love music, and they'd see what I did. They'd see that I had some accolades, but still it was like, can he make real money? Can he actually support a family with it? So that took a long time for that to.
Do you have any siblings?
I have a younger brother. Yeah, he's about 7 years younger than me. He's actually also very musical. We used to have a duo together. Not a duo, it was a trio in Sudbury. We called ourselves the Sudbury Brothers. And
who's the third?
Is a friend of mine who played bass. I played guitar. My brother plays drums, and we did all the pop tunes. We did Beatles stuff. We did it was stuff that was happening on the radio in those days, and we played some things here and there, some Indian functions and a couple of things. So he's very musical, but he's a lawyer as well.
I was going to ask what he ended up doing, but I guess he went down the conventional path, even though he also had a creative side to him as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess growing up in Sudbury, I imagine there's very few, if at all, any other like Tamil or like, I guess because I know you're from India, like Tamil families. Um, like
Yeah.
tell us about, I guess, how it was for you growing up in that kind of scenario. I know you had your brother, but
Yeah.
like how did you guys adjust as a family, as you know, you guys as kids? Like what was your experience like?
Yeah, there was maybe 50 Indian families in Sudbury at the time, and Tamils. I'm trying to remember. We have some friends who are Sri Lankan Tamil, who live in Sudbury, but they may not have, they weren't there at that time. They came in later. So I think, I'm trying to remember. No, there's one other Tamil family I remember. Maybe only one other Tamil family that I can recall right now. So growing up, yeah, I didn't grow up with a lot of Indians around me. I mean, mind you, the community, yes, but that was only during in times when we had community events, Diwali or prayer meetings, whatever it was, weekends. That's when I saw other Indians. Otherwise, I was in my high school. I was there was the only, I think I was the only Indian in my high school. There was one other Pakistani guy who was a year ahead or 2 years ahead, and there was a couple of Pakistani girls who were the same year as me. But I was the only Indian male at that high school through, I think as far as I know, my entire high school career, and that was tough. Really was tough. And I can get right to the racism now if you want.
Oh, I was gonna ask. I mean,
Right?
I know people have a notion that Canada doesn't really have that much of it. I think it's more subtle at times. But I
Oh,
know, especially like, when you were growing up, I think it was a bit
yeah.
more obvious. So yeah,
Yeah.
tell us about that.
Subtlety wouldn't be a word that I'd use to describe that in those days. No, I was overtly bullied. I was pushed around. I could look forward to it every day, to be pushed around. And if we were doing gym that day, I could be assured to be kicked and knocked into the mud or whatever it would be. It was bad. It was really bad. And I was called racist slurs. Um, and it was I remember my teachers kind of like, they didn't do anything in those days. They just sort of stand around and they kind of like look and they say, all right, that's enough, guys. It's kind of like, the whole boys will be boys, that kind of thing, right? So there was no protection really. And my dad was very much anti-violence, very much a pacifist, very much a Gandhian. And he used to tell me, oh, you can walk, just have to walk away. Like, can't always walk away from those things. You can try, and I tried many times. But I didn't get into fights. I was also I restrained myself, but there was a lot of racism, like against Indians, and probably also Black people that were there in Sudbury, and Indigenous people too. So it was a very racist place in those days. I did love it though. I mean, a lot of things I liked about it. I mean, uh, racism, I have to say, is one thing that led me to music. That really led me to music and to really exploring music in a very deep level, because I didn't want to go outside, and because I stayed in and I just did my music, and I found music, and I realized that, I could do that for a long period of time at one time. And so that was, I'm not going to say that I would change things, because who knows if I was the most popular guy in town, where I would have gone, right? I might not have gone to the music like I did. Ironically and interesting, my brother, who was, like I mentioned, 7 years younger than me, he actually was one of the more popular guys in the school.
What was the difference in like was it just like Sudbury became less racist or like more immigrant families, or
Well,
what was the
I,
change?
I think a little bit of all of that, because he definitely wasn't the only Indian there, and also he was more athletic, and so he was on different teams, and he ended up becoming the president of the school. It was a whole night and day scenario here. you know I was went through all that, a lot of bullying and a lot of racism, and he didn't go through any, I don't as far as I know.
How does that make you feel? Just kidding.
uh well, I don't care. I mean, I'm kind of, like I say again, it's like I've sort of evaluated those things quite a bit over the years, a lot over the years, and I've worked on a lot of different things as a musician, as an artist, as a human being, about my relationship with all those things, and I realize that things happen for a reason. And yeah, I mean, I'll never say racism is a good thing. I would never say, oh, you should encourage, you should try to get someone to be racist against you. It'll actually make you a better musician, something like that. But I will say that for me, that did, drive me, like it made me a little bit of a fire under my butt, and made me really decide, I love music. It wasn't the racism. I loved the music, but it was like, I'm going to make this happen. And I don't care if somebody else says this. It wasn't not just that. It was also like when I came across the many sort of challenges within the music industry, for many different reasons. And those, in those moments, I could fight back and work harder. I didn't give up, or it's like, maybe music isn't my thing. You know what I mean?
Do you ever look up those guys that bullied you on Facebook, or kind of see what they're up to?
I have.
Oh, you
I have, ironically, one guy that did bully me, I said to him, you used to treat me very badly. You used to bully me, and back in those days, he wasn't as much, because there was different groups of people who used to bully me. There was a certain gang that lived in my street. There was a couple of different groups in school. I mean, I was really into music, obviously, I'm in high school also. So in high school, I took music and took band and all that. And there was even like a guy in the band who he never called me racist slurs, but he bullied me in different ways. And he was the guy, like he that I sort of saw on Facebook, and I said, hey man, like, you realize, what you did back? He says, I don't remember that. All I remember is that I knew that you would make it big. I was like, wow, that's really weird. It's just like perception. And when you think about it, though, people who do that is part of it. Sometimes it's jealousy, right?
And insecurity.
Yeah. So, some of these things it's interesting when they reveal themselves later, potentially, whatever, whether this is really what happened or really what was happening in those days or not. But it certainly does, the perspective change. My perspective has changed on some of those things.
That's so fascinating that you kind of were able to, at least now, maybe shape the narrative, at least in your mind, that, what was a terrible thing when you were growing up as a young boy in Sudbury, kind of experiencing racism, actually drove you to kind of being musically inclined and over time being excellent at it, where now you're making a living. So it's like this thing that your brother didn't experience that you experience, change your trajectory, which is so fascinating.
Yeah. It's at the end of the day, it was like any kind of challenge experience, or experience that makes you question certain things about yourself. You can go, really two ways. One way is you can buckle, you can fall down, and you can give up, or you can fight, your fight, whatever that is, and keep going, and keep having some kind of optimism, or whatever, the fire or whatever it is under you. And I chose the latter. I mean, I've always been an optimistic kind of person. And, to give you an example, I've also been a pretty gullible and naive person in the past. I will accept that too. But it's a quick example. I mean, one of these kids who used to bully me all the time, and he used to do nasty stuff. Like I mentioned before, he'd trip me in the mud, and then he'd come over my face and laugh over me. And this was not a pleasant feeling. And I was the kind of guy, and again, I use the term gullible, but let me say innocent rather than gullible. Who if something that was in my mind, I had something, an example. There's a girl that I wanted to ask out on a date, right? And I was like so excited about this, and somehow this bully could tell something was up. And he says, oh, he started being nice to me. Oh, what's going on? What do you know? And like, well, I'm saying like an idiot, but I told him what I confided in this guy who bullied me all these years. I don't know where that came from, but maybe it's my innocence of trust in people. And of course, the whole school knew about it in the next 15 minutes. But so I managed to punch through or fight through without physically fighting a lot of these caustic and painful situations. Not that it didn't leave certain scars on me, for sure it did. And at one level, maybe it's a complicated discussion, but maybe that power was always there, didn't need to be activated through bullying, and maybe it was just the bullying would have maybe limited me. Maybe I would have been even bigger, more.
Like going back to your parents, like your dad especially, I think there was either the story of like you going to a specific program for school or work where like you didn't get in, and your dad kind of knew that failure would kind of, or he sensed it would crush you in a way, and he kind of went to bat for you.
Yeah.
And he got you a second opportunity, which obviously you turned and you capitalized on to be where you are today.
Yeah.
I call that the MVP, like a MVP moment for your dad. So I'm always fascinated by these things because I'm like a a young parent where like I have twins, and
Okay.
like, you know, these early beginnings and kind of interactions with parents, like kind of the things that you do can kind of really change the trajectory of like what your kids do. So
Yeah. Yeah.
um like, do you
Definitely.
like, when you reflect on that, like how does that, do you share the same sentiment, like that was like an MVP moment for your?
Well, yeah, I see it as like pivotal sort of decisions, right? And every, I mean, ultimately, where we are today is because of every decision that was made in our past,
Yes.
and where we are today is in itself and essentially it's an essential perfect place, because this is where we're meant to be. And perfect doesn't, it's not a qualitative judgment. It's just based on the fact that those decisions were made. This is where it needed, this is where it led things. And like my dad as a professor, and he knew I was always good in school. I had good marks in school. So he went to the dean of the last school that I auditioned for, and the only school that had not rejected me. But then in my audition, they called me in for an audition. I have a lot of stories. I take a lot of your time, but I'll real quickly tell this one. I think this is another pivotal story. This, and I think it's what's important about this was that I think there are people out there who may not even realize that this is part of their, maybe a part of their story too in some way. But what happened was I had sent audition tapes to all the schools that I applied for my undergrad, and I got rejection notices from all of them except for Laurier. And Laurier, and I found out later why I didn't. So my teacher told me this later. He told me this in my third year after I'd won this competition. I did classical music in my undergrad. So I came from zero classical music background to an undergrad in classical music and practiced like crazy. And then my second, third year, I was winning competitions. So he told me this after a particularly important competition that I won. He said, "You realize that you almost didn't come here?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, he was teaching and he went to the office and there was a tape being ready to be sent back and he hadn't heard the tape yet. That was my audition tape. He said, "Oh, let me just at least listen to it." She listened to it. He said, "No, there's some talent here. We should let him come into audition." So they let me come into audition, and then my audition where he wasn't there, I actually failed my audition. So that, double whammy there. And then but my dad heard about it, or there was I actually got a feeling or something I knew, or someone mentioned that somehow it had been mentioned to me. And he went and he talked to the dean. He sat down with the dean, one professor to another. He will do well here. I can guarantee he's going to work really hard. I don't know I wish I knew what my dad would have told her, because I wonder if he told her about how much time I spent on my music, which is the pop music or whatever it was in the basement, how diligent I was. Maybe that, rather than that, more than like a company with the good marks, that would have, for me, if as a professor now, that would have been the thing. I would have said, okay, this guy's he's actually started working on it even before he's come to university. Okay, let's give him a chance, right? So that was that moment there where they let me in. They said, okay, we'll let you in. So they let me in. And if it wasn't for that moment, I probably would have gone into computer science.
That's crazy.
So
That's remarkable. Well, that's a that's a big move on your dad, and that's a note that I'm making in my head of
yeah.
things, things to remember when opportunities like this come for my kids. If I can
Oh yeah.
step to bat for them, I will, hopefully.
Well, it's all those little seeds you plant, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All those little seeds you plant. So, and this is the whole thing about the JUNO. It's like I had no expectation of winning a JUNO. I never thought that I would win, and part of it's because of the kind of music that I write. It's not your typical jazz music, right? It's pretty eclectic. It has a lot of influences, especially world influences, and I've been in enough bands and I've seen enough of who won the JUNO in the past to like kind of write it off. I wrote it off last year. We were trying up to well, actually, funny thing is we're making this album. I remember me and my bass player were talking about it. We're like, let's just let that JUNO go. I don't think, well, yeah, you're probably right. Probably can't, we probably wouldn't fit into that space of, what people consider the jazz album of the year JUNO. But maybe we should make another album or some like other kind of album, which is more straight ahead or more whatever, and actually aim for a JUNO or whatever, right? Let this be the artistic project. And I said, yeah, I agree. It's probably right. So we just did what we needed to do, produce it how we wanted to produce it, etc. And then we got the nomination. And then I was like, I was flabbergasted. I was shocked that I even got a nomination. That was what I was aiming for. I was aiming for a nomination. right? Thought, okay, I got a nomination. Wow, this is amazing. Back in my mind, I was like, you never know, but I was like, I don't want to be too optimistic because I get disappointed too, like everybody else, right? And then, you see what happened. I mean, it's almost like this critical mass that you create over the years. And I've been creating this critical mass for the past 30 years, playing, professionally and writing music, spending hours and hours and hours and hours. There's a kind of a funny thing. My family, well, it's not that funny, but some of my family, like they like to make this joke that I don't have a job, right? That I don't work. That, yeah, you don't do any work. All you do, because my time is different than their time. Like my time's a little more flexible, but I'm working all the time. They don't see this, right? Yeah, put the kids to bed. I'm downstairs practicing or writing music or something, right? But all that time that I put in, after all those years, something's got to give. You put it with enough honesty and sincerity and authenticity. I believe that everybody can manifest in that way. It's kind of like you create that, the Malcolm Gladwell, tipping
10,000
point.
10,000 hours of purposeful
Yeah,
practice. Yeah.
yeah. And you create the tipping point with the decisions that you make. That there, though, like you said, is the key. What are the decisions that you make? That's really important.
This episode is sponsored by nobody. That's right, nobody. So if you could be kind enough to hit that subscribe button, that would mean a lot to me. There's a couple of facts or a couple of like things that I think of. One is compound interest, not just money wise, but like skills and like networks. And you've been doing it for 30 years. Like that's been compounding like crazy. A lot of people don't do something that long, like a particular kind of skill, industry, all that stuff. Number two is it's funny how I guess music is very similar to being an entrepreneur, which I am, where when people like kind of ask you what you do, you can't really fully describe all that you do, but you do a lot of stuff. And it's not necessarily like one continuous flow of like work or like what people consider work. It's kind of like in spurts where instead of like a cow grazing grass, you're kind of like a lion where you sprint and you do, work for like an hour or two when you're inspired or like, you're in that particular state of mind to do that task. And then you go take a break. And people kind of, if they catch you on the break, they're like, oh, you're never working. But like, you probably end up doing more work than somebody that's actually like in a 9 to 5 or typical job. So
but the thing about this type of career, it never stops.
Yes,
because there's always ideas, always music in my head. Mind you, when I'm sick, it's a little harder to do that. But when you're in the regular day, there's always stuff going on. And when you were saying that, it was interesting. I was thinking about like I kind of had this visual image of birds who fly about and collect little kinds of materials, maybe like little flower petals for their nest or whatever, and they collect this and that. And as they're collecting these flower petals and flying about, the seeds from these flowers or from whatever they're collecting are falling all over the place.
Yep.
Right. And so you find these things growing everywhere, and it's not because they ended up there randomly. I mean, they did. It's kind of random, but it's not random because there was an action behind it. There was an intention behind it. Right. And it wasn't the intention to particularly plant the seeds. It was intention to have something else, to accomplish something else.
Yep. No, I fully agree. Yeah, you're speaking about kind of like I actually was taking a listen to your album yesterday on Spotify.
Yeah.
And I'm not a jazz fan. I would say like my wife and actually your dad are like really into that. But I was just curious to kind of about your sound. And yeah, like it's not what I typically heard when I listened to jazz music. So it's very like interesting. Like so tell us kind of where you draw inspiration from, or like why you chose the influences or like the sounds that you do to kind of go into your music.
Well, I've through my study of music, I've heard a lot of different music, and my interests range, from when I was a high schooler to listening to bands like Rush, Pink Floyd, Yes, et cetera, art rock and top 40. And then later I studied some world music, classical music, jazz. So the music that I'm writing, I mean, at one point I would have told you I would have called it Indo jazz, but I'm not calling that anymore because I don't find that my music is just reflective of one thing. It's reflective of so many things. And at the end of the day, it's like, what have I listened to? What am I really into? For instance, this past couple of years, I've been a little bit more into, neo soul and jazz hop or jazz mixed with soul and jazz mixed with hip hop. Robert Glasper experiment, things like that. And that kind of crept, been creeping into my psyche, it's creeping into my brain and my ear. And when I write music, the music that comes out is something that's kind of an amalgamation of all the things I've been listening to, and it might have something that comes from, you know, art rock that I listened to when I was in high school, but I don't even realize it. Like, I had people tell me that I hear Yes in there, the band Yes. I hear that in there. It's like, wow, you know, think about it, maybe you were kind of right. I do hear that, but I was not thinking about that. Or I hear this or this. I hear so many different people telling me that they hear different things in the music because of all the music I listened to. So I'm trying not to make my music one thing. Like when someone says, you know, is it Indo jazz? In the back, you know, maybe the last album I would have said, yeah, it's more Indo jazz. This I'd say, I don't know, it's just jazz, world jazz, influenced by world music. I love Brazilian music. It's a big influence on me, like bossa nova, and African music, African drumming music. You know, when I lived in New York, I used to play with African drummers, and a lot of my drummers that played in my bands that's one big thing that they did, a lot of percussion in the bands that I played in. So that's crept in to my inner ear, and all this stuff is in there. So I would say I listen to all kinds of stuff. Like, I listen to everything. Any you know, a great musician and composer once said that there's only two kinds of music, you know, good music and bad music, right? And so anything that's good. I mean, I used to listen to country music. You know, I can get into it. I can get into heavy metal. I can get into I can get anything. I can get anything. You know, it depends. You know, if something's extreme, there's you know, extolling some violence or, you know, misogynism and stuff. I'm not into that. But, you know, any kind of good music, and, you know, that's a relative term, but yeah, there's a wide range of things I listen to. But I would say, if you want to get into you know, a little more broadly, or sorry, narrow it down a bit, jazz, from modern jazz to early jazz, and different kinds of world music, those are my biggest influences on my writing.
I know we kind of skipped ahead when we kind of started talking about you winning the JUNO, but even before that, like when you finished school and kind of getting into the professional world of being a musician, what was your first job, or like how did you find your first opportunity? Oh, I'm curious about that.
Well, so my first jobs weren't music. They were like odd jobs, like washing cars and stuff. But my music, when I went to undergrad, I was a classical major, like I mentioned, and then I started my teacher. I also have to thank, well, along the line, speaking of decisions, my teachers, I have to thank, like, very grateful to my teachers. The one guy, Doug Pullen, who was the guy who found the tape, he became my teacher, and for the next 4 years, and he was really important in my trajectory. Really made me create a lot of the foundations for me in my saxophone playing. And he also introduced me to jazz. He was a classical teacher, but he introduced me to jazz. And then I wanted to be able to do that. And one thing we have to do in jazz is, if you want to be able to do it, you actually have to play. So my friend and I, we found somebody who was also, you know, drummer and a bass player, who were interested in jazz, who had about little or none experience as we had. And we went out to a local bar, restaurant, like a wing joint, and said, can you give us a gig? He said, all right, I can give you a gig, I'll pay you in wings. I was like, all right, we'll do it, right? And so we did that once a week. I don't remember how long, but we did it for a while. And, you know, I sounded terrible. But, you know, we all do in the beginning, and worked hard. But the first thing was just playing for food, you know, when I was an undergrad.
And then how did that translate to your first gig for money?
Yeah, so then but in the meantime, I was practicing very, very, very hard. Yeah, I was putting in 8-hour days on the saxophone consistently. You know, I believe that anybody who wants to master something, there needs to be periods of obsession, and this was definitely obsession. I went through about 5-6 years of practicing 8 hours a day consistently, and it worked. Believe it or not. I actually got better fast, and then I started finding some things here and there where people, you know, I can't remember, I may have done a wedding or two when I'm undergrad, where I could play a couple of jazz tunes, and then but then my real more of a consistent thing I think the first thing that I did was playing music, wasn't jazz, was playing in the ceremonial guard band in Ottawa, and marching on Parliament Hill every morning in the summer. That was my first. I auditioned for that. I got in. It's a very high level marching band. I could practice a lot every day, and there was a bit of jazz happening too, and we played a lot. So I just found it, practiced for the audition, made it, and that was my first one, and that was not jazz. So my first one was classical music, and then jazz came after with the cruise ships when I started playing on cruise ships.
And like now, obviously, like, you had humble beginnings at the beginning, playing for Wings, and now, you travel, you're like a very highly acclaimed musician, and now you're, I don't know how often you're on the road now versus like in your heyday, but
Yeah.
you're constantly on the road and traveling for performances. So like, how do people like book you, or like, how does that like work in terms of like compensation point of view? I'm just like trying to understand that space of like, because I know with like, if you're like a beat maker or like in hip hop, kind of how kind of the money works there, but like how does it work in your world with like touring and
It's
music?
still it's still a networking world. I mean, I've networked hard over the past 20 years too. And people get to know who you are, and then you get a reputation. I did a pretty extensive tour in South Africa. I did some tours in Canada. I've toured not necessarily with my band, but with different bands. I've toured Europe with my own as a soloist, and Japan. So all these tours that I've done, the States, Europe, Africa. I played in India, played in Japan, etc. All these were started by networking. Started by talking to people. They started by, for instance, the tour. I did a tour in a pretty high profile tour in Europe of all the major jazz festivals. I did that with a big band out of New York. This big band was a Grammy nominated big band, and the leader of the band is kind of a legendary musician, and a couple of musicians in the band were also legendary, like elder statesman. He's in his probably 70 now, and these were all, so these guys had names, they had profiles, so I piggybacked on their profile and managed to get into he liked my playing. He asked me to play in this tour. I played this tour, and so piggybacked with him, and then you make contacts on the road that way, and then you follow up with them. So with my own projects, I have my Excel sheet with all my contacts that I try to, when it's not pandemic, I try to follow through with and see what's going on and see if there's anything going on, and try to pitch for another tour. And then you have to, do a tour nowadays. Very difficult to do a tour unless you have some kind of travel support. And the government has a bunch of arts grants. Consider, especially now with the airfares, to get over to Europe for 6 people, you're looking at $10,000, right, just to get over there. And then there's the fees, the hotels, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes a pretty complex and expensive endeavor. So there are grants where you can apply for these grants, and you have to have a high level product and also be able to write a grant well. Then you can get them, and I've been able to get a few of them that help me tour. So it's a networking thing. And if I had a huge name, like if I was Zakir Hussain, it wouldn't matter, because then everybody would just call me, and I'd have a manager, and I could just focus my music. I don't have to do anything else. But as it is now, I have to do my legwork. I have to call people. I have to send emails. I have to make the pitch, and then hopefully the tour comes through. So it's a lot of work.
So I guess it's like you're pretty much running a business while being a musician, where
Yep.
before going on tour, you got to make sure whatever you're getting paid covers your
Yep.
costs, your salaries, or like whatever everyone wants to get paid.
Yep. It doesn't. And most of the time it does not.
Oh, it doesn't cut like the cost of what you're getting. The
Most
money
of
you're
the
making doesn't cover your costs.
No, most of the time it does not. Like if I get what I got, like I did that tour, I got a grant to South Africa. It's kind of like I saw it also as kind of exchange, Canadian, South African exchange. Guys doing workshops and things like that too, in schools and that. I think I only lost a bit of money. I didn't lose a ton of money on that tour, but it was a big tour. And South Africa's, there's a lot of air flights. You have to fly to every city practically. It's such a big country. So it was expensive. And so, yeah, I don't think I've had a couple of tours where I've made a little bit of money, but often you don't. And this is this is a conversation that could be very long, because how do musicians do it? Well, the only way the most can do it, the way most can do it is because they have to teach. They also have to teach, right? So they have to teach, and then people accept that they're not going to make a ton of money on tour. They make, you do the best you can, and then you make a certain amount of money is depending on your profile, and then hopefully that is satisfactory, and then maybe you'll sell some CDs while you're on the road. Now I don't even sell CDs. Nobody even buys CDs. So that's not in the picture.
So I guess for you, it's like the touring kind of satisfies the creative, or like that, like, just kind of being live and engaging with fans of jazz and music. And then the teaching part, you still get to engage with that side where you're teaching folks about music, or the next Sundar, right? But I guess like really the teaching is subsidizing you being able to go on tour, essentially, along with grants, hopefully, that you get.
Yeah. I mean, every now and then you'll get something where it covers your airfare, and you'll make a taste after that. Like you'll make a little bit of money after that. So yeah, but I mean, I gotta say, I gotta give a big shout out to Canada Council for the Arts and Ontario Arts Council, because they have supported a lot of great music, Canadian music being spread around the world. Without them, the music, our music would not go to the places that it goes. So it's amazing thing that we have that. I mean, it's kind of like the NEA, or in the States, where they have certain grants. In the States, it's a lot more about corporate grants. So they have a lot more corporate money that goes towards the arts. Canada doesn't have that so much. So that's our.
Do you think that'll change in the future, or do you think it'll just?
I would love that there would be more people. Look, at the end of the day, I would love it if presenters would pay what artists are worth. What happens often is when you're playing a festival or a concert or something, they have other people, like concert series. There might be one or two big names in the run. They'll save all their money for those big names, and then they'll have like some left over for everybody else. The fees vary incredibly in this industry. And I know this too, because I used to program music for an arts organization. For 10 years, I was a programming chair of an arts organization, and we used to present legendary artists and also local artists, and the money ranges widely, the fees. And I just would like to see in the future that artists get paid closer to what they're worth. The thing is that most people they only see, oh yeah, but Michael Jackson, look how rich he was. Of course, Michael Jackson was rich, but how many Michael Jacksons were there? How many starving people out there that are playing music? Maybe not as well as Michael, but there are some out there who I would probably as talented as him, but just aren't getting the breaks, right? And they're not able to. So then they end up like, some end up giving up, or they end up doing something else to get frustrated. So it's a much more challenging industry than maybe a lot of people know.
So I guess in these kind of industries, like whether it's music or like other ones like this, it's always, I guess, advice could be potentially start earlier, so that when you do have less overhead in your life or less responsibility, you can kind of really go after it.
Yeah, that's one great way to get the momentum going, is when you start young, and then people touring when they're 20s. Like I've heard about bands that will still, they'll rent a van, they'll travel across the country, sleep in the van. Say, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
That 20 years ago, yeah, I could do it, but I can't do that anymore.
You've been to a lot of places, like kind of when you travel, you mentioned like Japan, South Africa, etc. Outside of like Canada, which is awesome, which place in the world did you really like, from both like a tourist point of view, but also like playing your music, like in terms of people enjoying your music?
Japan was amazing.
I love Japan, by the way. I've been there once, and I love it. But yeah, continue.
Incredible place. I mean, there's, first of all, in Tokyo, there's something like 200 jazz clubs, probably the most jazz clubs of any city in Tokyo. But some of them are tiny. They're 20 seats or whatever it is. And playing some of these clubs, no one would understand English, right? I'd be playing. And I was playing, for that one, I was doing a couple original stuff, but mostly standards. I was singing and playing on that tour. And, even my band, who was Japanese musicians, none of them could really speak English very well. So the language of music had to serve for everything, right? Explain how to, this tune and this tune, how this works. It was all, just show how this works. And the people in Japan are different in jazz clubs. They don't clap after you take a solo, after you improvise, whereas here they'll clap. And so my first couple of concerts, I was like, do they really like? Are they, what are they thinking? But then at the end, they get, there's a lot of applause, and they're very happy and very enthusiastic and very accommodating, very respectful. I really appreciated that. As someone who dedicated significant part of their life to music, a jazz musician, let's say, getting respect as an artist is really important, because it's a very, very difficult. It's difficult. Like I not to say that anything else is not difficult, but music, being on stage and trying to perform at a certain level consistently it's not easy. There's a lot of stresses and expectations and the such. And Japan, I found, was really great that way, and the food was amazing, and the people were really friendly and accommodating and respectful. So I enjoyed that.
Did you know that every time you left a 5 out of 5 review for this podcast, a Tamil parent lets their child pursue a career in the creative arts? Okay, that's probably not true, but if there's a chance that it is, do you really want to jinx it? Leave a review. Do it for the young creative in you. Do you find that since you've toured, like you said, you moved away from home at a young age, you've been traveling a lot for like work as well, do you feel less connected to being Canadian or like just Canada because you're away so often, or like do you still feel that connection because of whatever reason, strong roots here?
I definitely feel the connection to Canada. I mean, the more I see about world politics, the more connected. Well, I mean, not that Canada's doing all the great things, but at least, seeing what's happening with the divisions in the States and the kind of fighting that's going on, the nonsense that's going on down there. I definitely am grateful to be here, extremely grateful. And then going in some other parts of the world, looking at some different standards of living, South Africa, as I have to tell you, South Africa was, it really, I left, they say I left my heart in San Francisco. I left my heart in South Africa. It's such an incredibly warm and moving country. So there's different things about different, parts of the world. I mean, it's also potentially a dangerous place. And there's a lot of friction that that's going on there. Even besides the really, really nice people, there's still a lot of things going on there. But that, it adds a certain excitement to the air, I guess. But I'm not sure whether I could. I almost lived in South Africa. I got offered a job there, teaching position there, but I had just actually started at York when I got offered that position. So I maintained my York job. But there's something to be said about some other countries that maybe don't have the things we have, that are still kind of like striving in a way, or that maybe there's a different kind of way of looking at things. They appreciate things more than we do, and they act that way. Like they act, there's more gratitude, over in some of those places. So I do like traveling. I do like coming back home.
Well, you've been doing music for a long time. And like I said, it's very rare for someone to stick with something for a long time and get to a point where you have a level of excellence you've tried to maintain and strive for. And, the JUNO kind of validates that. How do you, it's kind of like a relationship with even like a person, like if you're like married or just a long-term relationship, like how do you maintain your passion with music? Like what are some things you do to kind of get yourself excited, keep learning, etc.? Like what do you do?
Well, sometimes, sometimes it's a matter of finding new music that is moving me, it's, the thing is though, when I start, like there's days when I'm like, okay, I gotta get on the instrument, but I don't feel like, don't feel like getting on it. But then it's just like, okay, let me just get on it. So let me see what happens if I just play it for 10 minutes. 10 minutes turns into an hour and a half, like nothing. So you start playing it and you get to a certain point where, in your career where you've developed an ability where you can, it feels good to play. Right. And so you're playing it and then it starts to feel good and better. And then I'm practicing for 3 hours, so it's just a matter of just doing it. My brain might not want to do it, but my body remembers those feelings, how good it feels to play. and then I start to listen to music while I'm playing or this and that. And another way I do this is I will remember music that inspired me when I was growing up, like that really moved me and that really made me sort of see why I did music. And then I'll put that on and that will flicks the switch, and I feel that inspiration, that humility, that love that comes from knowing that music is a very, very important thing, not only to me, but just in general to humanity.
When you won the June, like your Juno, because you've been nominated twice, I think before as a composer for Jaffa Road, I believe, right?
Yeah, twice for Jaffa Road. Then I was also a part of a couple of the bands that were nominated. But
So then finally breaking through for Worldview,
yeah,
you kind of already mentioned like even being nominated was amazing, but like what was that moment like when you found out that you guys actually
oh, it was
won? Like
surreal.
you had that breakthrough.
Yeah, it was surreal because we didn't, they don't tell you this ahead of time, right? So I had prepared a speech just in case, I had the speech written up, and then we were sitting at our dining tables at the Junos, and I'm looking, and the ladies mentioned something about 30 seconds per person. I was like, if I get up there, I'm never going to be able to read this in 30 seconds. My friends, my band was like, yeah, you better edit that, just edit. I was like, I started editing it, and then they announced the winner, and they said Avatar. And I was like, what? I think my wife said that. I said, oh my God, or something like that. And then so my speech went out the window because it's just like, I just went up there and I said what I was feeling. So it was very surreal. Like it was a surreal, I felt like that for a good couple of weeks, like just kind of like this very unreal. And it was weird because it was unreal. I'm very grateful, but it was at one level, it was a little bit anticlimactic in a way, because okay, I got here. Now what do I do? What's the next? But then everyone's saying, you gotta just enjoy this. Okay, I promise I'll try to enjoy it. I'm the type of person who is always like trying to think ahead, right? To like the next thing that I can do. And so I got to learn to enjoy things in their moment better.
I think a lot of successful people, like I see it in entrepreneurship where they, when you start off, it's like, oh, I would love to sell my company for $1 million. And you get there, it's like, oh, I'd love to sell it for 10 or 100.
Yeah,
It's like no level of success is, unless you train yourself, it's like a muscle that
yeah,
this is enough. Let me enjoy. I've got to where I want to. You obviously don't want to get complacent, but there's the other side, which is nothing is ever enough, which can be a dangerous place as well.
yeah. Well,
Um,
I don't think the actual acquisition of the Juno, when I think about it, was the goal, as I may have thought it was in the past, which is interesting. Although I have several goals, right? That was one goal. So let's say I did check that one off, but there's many other goals that I have. My uncle, I remember in the past he used to say stuff. My uncle was the one guy. Say that if I would pick anybody who fully supported anybody of like that generation in my family who fully supported me in my musical career was my uncle. And he always wanted to have, I think he had a not so secret desire to want to be a musician also. He does a lot of film music. He does little bands where he does like Hollywood music and Bollywood music and stuff like that. But he wanted to be a musician, quote unquote. And I was kind of like he was able to sort of live vicariously through me. And so he would support me. And I remember one place I said, just, he doesn't remember saying this, but he told me, when you win a Grammy or whatever like that, just mention my name, right? Something like that. And I did mention his name. I couldn't mention it when I was on the stage because I got flustered and I forgot to mention some stuff. But I did in other interviews. I've talked about my uncle, and he said, I don't remember saying that. I'm just happy that you won. It's like, what? But the point is that certain goals are there and you think they're big goals and then you get them and then it just moves to something else.
I noticed when you were talking, and I see this with like other folks that are Indian, or maybe it's like I noticed the difference between Sri Lankan Tamils and Indian Tamils, where when you refer to yourself or like your primary identity, it's Indian versus when it's with Sri Lankan Tamils, it's like Tamil.
Oh,
Um,
I see.
I don't know if you've noticed that, but like
Yeah.
I'm just curious about that. Like, did you identify more as Indian or Tamil growing up, or both, or like, yeah,
Well,
I'm just curious.
I should note I was born in India and I was there for 3 years of my life. I was born in the South in Tamil Nadu. And I would say that when I refer to myself as Indian, I mean, I'm not fluent in Tamil. I can understand Tamil like fairly well. So that's part of the reason why I wouldn't say Tamil, I suppose. Although my family, we have our Tamil jokes and bad words and all the other stuff that all the families have. And, so there's definitely a Tamilness to our family. Like my brother and I, are part-time comedians, not like literally part-time. In our family, everyone's a comedian in our family. Let's put it that way. Everyone's always got jokes. We're always dissing on people, our uncles and aunts for, characteristics. And like, there's a bunch of characters in my family, like probably any Indian family, but there's a Tamilness about that, about like, Master of None, right? You've seen that?
Yes, great
So
show.
I swear to God, I have like 3 or 4 people in my family that should have been in that show. Would have nailed it if they're like that, but they wouldn't have had to change who they are. They just have to be themselves. They would have just perfectly fit in. So there is a Tamil thing about, couldn't describe it to you, but there's just something about it that does make us Tamil, but I do think of myself as Indian.
Yeah, no, it's just an observation I made. I feel like part of it could be like political, where like a lot of Sri Lankan Tamils don't identify as Sri Lankan. It's like
right
because of obviously like politics. So it's like we're Tamil versus like India, you don't have that complication. It's like, you're Indian, you're also Tamil, but you probably refer like, I don't say I'm Canadian Tamil, I say I'm Canadian, but I do say I'm Tamil as well. So I was just curious about that. In terms of, I guess, looking back, how old are you now?
I'm 55.
And like, if you were to kind of go back in a time machine and see, visit your 16-year-old self, what would you tell him?
I say this too, first of all, this too shall pass. And everything happens for a reason. You're going to be okay. It's going to be fine. Just keep going. This is all you're kind of in a game. You're in a game right now. Just play the game and keep slugging through.
And like looking forward, like in terms of like a personal legacy point of view, like how would you want to be remembered by your friends and family? If, in a few sentences, like how would you want to be described?
Well, I'd like to have made a difference, whether my music makes a difference or my actions make a difference, to touch people, to bring them closer to, being in a place where there's more self-realization, where people can, and there's more truth, with a capital T. So in other words, I would like to have made a difference in people's lives and had them, become better people, and or experience beauty. Have to my music help them do that.
And that's a good way to kind of segue into the last segment of the podcast. It's a fun speed run I like to call Creator Confessions. So I'm going to basically just say a bunch of statements and you tell me the first thing that pops into mind.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right. Favorite Tamil food?
I said idli, but it's not. But that's what come to my head.
Something that scares you?
Bears.
I never heard that one before. Insecurity that you have?
Yeah, I'm a short guy. My height.
Favorite show you're watching?
Or
watched recently?
I watched recently. Yeah, I mean, I liked as old House of Cards was a good show. I like that a lot.
Somewhere you're itching to travel to?
Yeah, I would love to go back to French Polynesia.
A fellow Tamil creator you want to give a shout out to?
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, and I can't remember his name, the guy from Master of None. Well,
Aziz Ansari.
Aziz Ansari, yeah, he's a good guy. I was also going to mention a friend of mine named Subha Shankaran, who's a great Tamil musician.
Favorite childhood memory?
I would say one of them is sitting on the roof terrace in Coimbatore, my grandpa's estate house, and listening to my uncle play with his band, the Spiders, and keeping time on some little pieces of cookware.
What do you do for fun outside of work?
I'm a foodie, so I like to cook. I like to find new restaurants, travel. Yeah. So
favorite movie of all time? It can be English, Tamil, or you could say both of them.
Well, Lord of the Rings is up there.
Something you've purchased in the last few years that you splurged on, but you have no regret about it.
Well, my saxophones.
Pet peeve.
Yeah, pet peeve when people they don't keep their promises. They don't admit it. Like they don't admit their. That's it. Okay, I'll take it back. Can I take it back? Hypocrisy. Hypocrites.
A person or celebrity that you look up to?
Yeah, I would say dead or alive, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
John Coltrane.
If you knew that you were going to die tomorrow, a regret that you would have.
I was just thinking about this.
Money can be hard to come by, but here is a $100 opportunity for you. Join my free newsletter for free exclusive content and a free chance to win $100 when I hold special draws. Did I mention that it's free?
I think I'd regret. There's a couple of guys that when I was going to school in my master's, who were these legendary artists who I didn't know who they were at the time. And I remember I was practicing, and he was teaching at the school that I studied, but I never studied with him. And I was practicing. He comes in, he gets something from the room, and he's about to leave. He goes, you should study with me. And he was probably about 75 at the time, or 80. He was older, and he's a master. And I kind of looked at him and said, I remember thinking, why would I want to study with him when I'm studying with this other person? And now I'm like kicking myself because that guy was a genius.
Mm.
I know this because, and I know, I was thinking about it specifically because I know my younger self was like, I can't believe I was thinking like that, but I can see other kids do that, make that same sort of decision sometimes. I can see them thinking that way too sometimes.
A person who's like, it could be a celebrity, but anybody whose life you'd want to experience for just one day.
It's funny. It's coming back to musicians, but I'll say Miles Davis.
A book you've read or a podcast you've listened to that's recently that's had an impact on you.
Recently. Man, I wish I had more time to do reading. Podcast. Gosh, there's a podcast about, I can't remember the name of it. It's a health podcast. Gary Haberman or something is his name.
Yes, Huberman Labs.
Yeah, Haberman Labs. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some. I think I have some pretty cool stuff there.
Oh yeah, his stuff is good. The podcast episodes are long, but really good material. I listened to the one about getting sunlight first thing in the morning and the science behind that. That's been pretty impactful.
Yeah.
A belief, behavior, or habit that's improved your life.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
And finally, a piece of advice you'd give to aspiring Tamil creators out there.
Well, find out what your passion is. And if it's really your passion, there may be some decisions that you have to make, whether those feed your passion or they don't feed your passion, and be willing to make those choices. But don't get thrown off the pathway of your passion, because there'll be many opportunities to go off the path and to not come back. Sometimes you have to go off the path to come back, but the decisions you make should always lend themselves to your goals.
And that's a good way to end the podcast. Sundar, there's been some great nuggets of information. For me, not knowing about the world of jazz, and just I've learned a lot in this conversation. For somebody listening that is inspired and could be the next you, what is the best way for someone to reach out to you if they want to connect?
Yeah, my website is www.sundarmusic, sundarmusic.com, and you can email me at sundar@sundarmusic.com. Happy to take your emails, and you can check out my music on my website as well and look at some videos. I always like to hear from other artists, especially South Asian artists. Yeah,
I actually just released an episode maybe 3 or 4 episodes ago. B. Beeman, you should check him out. He's got like I didn't expect the level of quality of his voice to be what it is. It's a very unique sound.
What's his name?
B. Beeman.
B. Beeman.
Yeah, you should check it out. I'll send it to you after. He's
sounds good.
Very, very talented. Well, thank you again, Sundar, for jumping on and sharing your story, considering especially that you got that fatigue going on. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to share your story. And for everyone listening, thank you as always. And feel free to reach out if there's any feedback. And on to the next episode.